Hello, listeners, and welcome to Privacy Chats with Rachel and John. I'm John.
And I'm Rachel, your host, who will be taking you through a fascinating case study that will cause you to challenge and test your knowledge about healthcare privacy laws here in the US. Before we start this episode, I'll share that the information in this episode is of the opinions of our own and not in any way affiliated with our employers or other organizations. These episodes are produced in our own time and are based on our own research and professional opinions. Last but not least, I want to acknowledge that it's been a little bit of time since we last chatted, right, John?
It has been a while, but I think that we've just been busy, and it's okay to give ourselves some grace and kind of come up with these as we're able to. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's fine.
What have you been up to lately?
Well, you know that we're both busy at work, but we're not allowed to talk about that.
Of course.
We have the disclaimer. No, actually, my wife and I were recently on a trip. We visited London for a few days and Amsterdam for a few days and did all of the things. If you picture in your head what you're supposed to do, actually, not all of the things in your head about Amsterdam. We didn't do all of those things, but there's some really cool things to see in both of those cities. We even happened to be there when the king was out doing, there was one of those big parades with the soldiers with the big hats.
Yes. Nice.
So
Got
we
good
saw
pictures
those.
too, I imagine.
We did, yeah. How about you? What have you been up to?
Yeah, we've been good, staying cool here in Phoenix. It's over 100 degrees, I'm sure, right now. And I took a couple weeks to visit parts of France and Italy. So I was also in Europe, maybe not in the same corner, but around the same time as you. I had a good time as well.
That's awesome. I love it.
Yeah.
Okay, so what do we got? We have yeah, this is I have to say I didn't know anything about this content, and I'm glad that you brought it up, and I've read some about it, but you've done the bulk of the research on this. So I don't know,
Yeah.
let's jump in. What do you got?
Tee it up. I was very casually on my phone. I don't know what news site I was perusing through, but I found an interesting case of a man, a surgeon, in fact, who is currently facing federal charges after exposing alleged continuation of gender-affirming care at a Texas children's hospital. I promise this has to do with privacy, but I will have to get into the details first. And it's not the most lighthearted story told in this channel, but a really important one to understand the potential implications of HIPAA and kind of dissecting the privacy and in healthcare and how that relates to the story. So a Houston surgeon, Ethan Haim, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, had intentionally leaked internal patient documents that allegedly showed that Texas Children's Hospital continued to provide gender-affirming services to minors. This disclosure was politically motivated, as Haim had shared the protected information in documents with a senior fellow at a conservative think tank, the spirit of, I'd imagine, whistleblowing on the hospital support and participation of gender-affirming care.
Yeah, there's a lot there. It's an interesting topic, and I'm hoping that we're going to get into some parts of this because I'm of the mindset that any medical procedures are really that's a discussion that people have with their doctors, and it's really none of anyone else's business. But I think this one's going to get more complicated.
Oh, absolutely.
So yeah, so keep going, say more.
Yeah. So in case you don't know, gender-affirming care is a very contentious issue in a state like Texas. Back in 2022, the state attorney general, Ken Paxton, issued an opinion stating that gender-affirming care was a form of child abuse. In response to this opinion, Governor Greg Abbott directed the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services to investigate parents who sought gender-affirming care for their children. About a month later, Texas Children's Hospital announced that the hospital would pause those gender-affirming services for minors. However, according to Haim, the hospital secretly continued to provide gender-affirming care to children throughout the following year, which then prompted Haim to share this confidential health information regarding those procedures and the patients that underwent them. Actually went into sharing that information publicly.
Yeah, so again, there's so much in that. So like the initial thoughts that I had were that the opinion that came from you said it was the governor or the state attorney general.
The state attorney general.
State attorney general issued an opinion. So attorney general is essentially a lawyer, right? So I have to wonder how much that opinion was informed by medical professionals. So, which, that's troubling to me. You mentioned that the hospital, despite this new rule or opinion that was issued, the hospital announced that it was going to pause gender affirming services, but then decided to keep doing them on the down low, which I appreciate any healthcare provider wanting to provide services to its patients or its population. But why aren't they just like fighting back against, the opinion? If they didn't agree with the opinion or they thought it was wrong, like fight back against it and don't do it on the down low. But
Agreed.
I appreciate that they were trying to offer necessary services to their constituents. So overall, it's an unfortunate situation all around. I did read, prompted by your research. I decided to go back and read the opinion that was written, and I didn't get through the whole thing. But at one point, it was the whole thing kind of equates the gender affirming care as sterilization of children. Um, and one quote that I pulled from it, it says, historically weaponized against minorities, sterilization procedures have harmed many vulnerable populations, such as African Americans, female minors, the disabled, and others. And that made me mad because they're trying to say we're doing this to protect the vulnerable populations in our society, which, frankly, I'm not so sure if we're supposed to curse on here, but that's bullshit. That just made me mad that they're trying to, paint themselves as being, anyway. This is supposed to be a privacy podcast. I feel like I'm getting a soapbox. I'm
It's
going to
hard to
turn it back over
separate.
to you. It
No,
is. So,
unfortunately, in September 2023, and maybe this will provide color on more of the legal implications, but Senate Bill 14 went into effect, which is a law that prohibits Texans under the age of 18 from accessing those treatments, such as puberty blockers. They name hormone therapies and surgeries as well. So at least in the eyes of Texas and the Attorney General, in the case of Texas Children's Hospital, they were indeed breaking the law. And again, I won't speak, hello, Cat. I won't speak to the, my opinions on it, but it does provide complexity to the situation. I think it is very hard to separate, the political implications with the decision of the hospital, of course. But
right.
that is, at least in all of the opinions written on it, the defense coming toward this surgeon that, claiming he did the right thing in releasing this information. Again, that information does have implications on the individuals involved, though. Your decision to go under gender affirming care, especially as minors, is very sensitive to me. Despite whether it is considered illegal in your region or your jurisdiction or not. And so
Yeah.
it is a fascinating and complex piece of news for sure.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that part of it being illegal or not being illegal, but either way, there was definitely disclosure of sensitive health information, which
Right.
is a violation of HIPAA. So, like, is it
Absolutely.
okay to violate one law to uphold another, or I guess be a
Shed light on
whistleblower? But
it. Yeah.
yeah, right. So yeah, this was a HIPAA violation, clearly, right?
Yes, in fact, and HIPAA, HIPAA, for those
Yeah.
newer to the space, is a federal law that prohibits healthcare providers and covered entities from disclosing protected information to anyone other than the patient and the patient's authorized representatives without their consent. This was absolutely done without their consent. And it's tough to imagine that Haim was really in the position to have this information, but we'll get into that in a second.
Yeah. So okay, so why did he have the information? Or yeah, let's
I'll
keep going.
say, yeah, according to the recipient, which again was not a law enforcement official, it was a conservative think tank, I don't know, director, news advocate, who knows, but he, according to allegation evidence, the documents provided by him contained no identified individual. But again, that was super vague, and I assume in light of trying to improve the optics of this whole situation. A press release, though, last Monday from the U.S. Attorney's Office, the indictment language alleges that Haim obtained patients' names, treatment codes,
Mhm.
and the attending physician's name through an electronic healthcare system without authorization. So at least from, the U.S. Attorney's Office, we have proof that patients' names, treatment codes, and physicians' names were exposed here. There's no doubt that that is identifiable information.
Yeah.
He was in the hospital's system apparently as a med student in residency and allegedly requested that he have his access to the login system reactivated to access these pediatric patients who were not currently under his care at all.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of problems with that, and I kind of read the same thing, maybe in a different article because it had a slightly different spin on it, but
Mhm.
that he at one point did have access to patient data at this hospital, lost that access, not I think just because he wasn't working there anymore, and then asked to have the access restored, not because he was working there again, but just because he wanted access to this data and was granted the access. Which makes me think that the hospital itself was at fault. So, like, the hospital has responsibility here to make sure that people who are not treating patients don't have access to patient data. I
Absolutely.
even wonder, like, if like there's lots of doctors and who either work for the hospital or they have privileges to treat patients at hospitals, um, who are only treating certain patients. And part of me as a security privacy professional, I think that that should be not role-based access, but they should only have access to the data for the patients that they're treating. That being said, in some cases, you would need other doctors to have access to that data in an emergency or, I don't know, for a consult or something like that. So they should be allowed to be open. But stuff like this happening makes me question that.
Yeah,
Like it
certainly.
seems to me that all doctors and probably nurses, all people providing healthcare have access to all data. But clearly there's logging that happens. It'll show if somebody's accessing data for patients that they shouldn't be. But anyway, like it's definitely an offense.
Absolutely.
And yeah, keep
I
going.
I don't doubt that the hospital will see some form of liability or penalty from this. It prompted me to look up the, security rule, which lays out under HIPAA, which lays out three types of technical security safeguards, one being technical, one being physical, and administrative.
Okay.
And very easily I was able to pick out a few, again, standards. Some are required, some are flexible, but picked out some standards which would, in my opinion, had prevented something like this from happening. One of them was, the fact that, again, like you said, it wasn't restricted information for
Hmm.
only professionals that need to know that information. So access controls were certainly not in place.
Right.
They should be maintaining who is current in the system and tracking the modifications and making sure that any access is terminated once they leave.
Right.
I assume that Haim got access to this perhaps while he was in residency, but that this information is a little bit desperate and it's not so clear whether he perhaps should have been terminated from a certain sector of the system or shouldn't have had access to begin with because he never cared for those patients, much like what we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Even access to this equipment is considered, a physical safeguard if it's not well monitored and he reobtained access to a system, prior to a physical system he shouldn't have access to. Why is that? So there's a lot of details that I know probably in the coming weeks and months, perhaps years, will be clarified. But there's definitely something going amiss as far as the Texas hospitals controls and risk management procedures for their patients' healthcare information, in my opinion.
Yeah. No, agreed. But I would say that those practices are probably similar in a lot of healthcare organizations that, you trust healthcare professionals, or you should be able to trust healthcare professionals and not have to have, stringent controls on, individual pieces of data. But you talked about penalties. What's the penalty for this guy?
Yeah, so according to one of the articles, and again, I'll kind of go down and disclaim this in the form of numbers and breakdowns from the Department of Health and Human Services, but if
Okay.
convicted, apparently he could face up to 10 years in federal prison and a $250,000 fine. Which is no
Yeah.
small number. He really risked it for this one.
It's true, and I that number sounded high to me, and
Mhm.
I didn't fully finish kind of fleshing that whole thing out, but a quick search in the internet, and the first thing came up was from the American Dental Association. Um, but I trust them. There's a trustworthy source. But so they say that the criminal penalty and a fine of up to $50,000 and up to 1 year imprisonment. However, this could be multiplied because they could be applying that an instance or $50,000 per instance and for
Right.
multiple patients. So it could be both right that it's $50,000 and a multiplier. So
Right. This, I mean, with this case being pretty politically nuanced and certainly an exception, I would say across the entire picture of HIPAA complaints and enforcement. I
yeah.
went to the US Department of Health and Human Services website in the Office for Civil Rights to see how many complaints they actually have received since the privacy rule was enacted in April of 2003, and some of
Okay.
the subcategories of those complaints and how they were resolved. So bear with me because, this was just out of my own curiosity. They've
Okay.
seen total cases 358,975 in the last, 21 years, which is quite astounding. I mean, we're talking about one office processing all these complaints, and these, the decision of whether to investigate, I'm sure, is not lightweight at all. Um, I won't go into
Yeah,
numbers
but if you
anymore. Sorry, go ahead.
but if we break that down though, so that's over 20 years.
Yes,
So
21
if
years.
I'm bad at math, but if I do 100, it's like 15,000 per year
Correct.
or something like that. So that doesn't sound terrible to me. If you think about the population of the country and the number of patients there are and providers, 15,000 violations per year. That doesn't sound terrible to me. But anyway, I
Yeah.
interrupted you. Go
Having
back to
trouble
where you're
remembering.
heading.
I know I came across a number of the actual, like the number of covered entities covered by HIPAA as of a certain date. I'm losing
Hmm.
it. I want to say it's in the 1 million range, but that's sounding high to me. Definitely
Okay,
on Wikipedia as they break down HIPAA, but I'll go into the percentages of how those 350,000 some cases were investigated, whether they were resolved, no violation,
sure.
etc. So the highest percentage category, almost 70%, 69.3, they found that no eligible case was actually present. So that language to me presumes that no further steps were taken. They basically said this is not qualified under the types of violations that you would see under HIPAA, or there wasn't
Yeah.
enough evidence, I presume. It wasn't taken a step further. The next highest category, they had the OCR had intervened without investigation. So perhaps they had seen some form of misconduct, perhaps minor, or perhaps it was a gap in how, those, like we were saying, technical, administrative, and physical safeguards perhaps were applied, that led to evidence that perhaps another party receiving services or on the outside had detected or identified. Again,
Okay.
presumptuous, I wasn't able to look into cases in that category, but the
Sure.
next two, 8.7% of complaints were investigated and resolved. So I assume that is actually in the, probably in the received some sort of fines, penalty,
Yeah.
slap on the wrist paperwork to say, hey, we're not going to do whatever you were complaining to do again, and here's proof, and here's
Yeah.
your commitment to resolve those bad practices. Finally, a little over 4%, 4.3, resulted in no violations. So they were investigated, but there wasn't actually a HIPAA violation to occur, but it was suspected there was at the time of investigation.
So I think those numbers are actually really good. So, I already responded and said, 350,000, 58,000, whatever, breaks down to, could be bad math here, but about 15,000 per year, around about. But you then said that 70% of those are not issues at all. So
They weren't
the
taken
actual number
further.
is even smaller, right?
That's right.
So that means one of two things. Either DHS isn't doing its job to follow up on things or whatever, or not receiving complaints, or the healthcare industry is doing a really good job. And I'd like to think it's the second, because a lot of people, when you say HIPAA, people
Yeah.
often complain about that. You're violating my privacy, and they'll
Yeah.
point to HIPAA as the thing. So HIPAA seems to be the thing that people are most aware of as a privacy thing. And I'd say kudos to the healthcare industry for that, because they are taking it seriously and are protecting our health information. So thumbs up, healthcare.
Certainly, patients are a larger number than covered entities and doctors, providers,
Yeah.
business associates underneath that. So surely the awareness has worked on at least the patient end, and you assume that cascades up to those really responsible that have to know and really be in the weeds with these this regulation. So the act is successful from my accord. I will have to see whether it is something that begs this case to actually impose any fines or investigation
Yeah.
onto the entity that we're talking about here. Um,
Fair. So don't call me Shirley. Uh, but so okay, let's go back to the whistle, this particular case.
yeah, there have been comments I've read that, say that criminal charges for this guy should be totally dropped, given that he was exposing information in the spirit of reporting the hospital's illegal activities. Um, However, this is a major leap, and I think perhaps what they're misinterpreting is HIPAA does have a law enforcement, quote unquote, carve out that says a HIPAA covered entity may disclose PHI to law enforcement without
Right.
the individual signed HIPAA authorization, so without their consent. Um, I mean, there would have been, maybe I'm leaping again, I'm not an attorney, but perhaps if this guy went to a law enforcement agency of any degree or form, perhaps
Mm-hmm.
this might come into play, but he didn't. He shared this information with a third party that had absolutely no business having these healthcare records for any purpose other than to stir up some noise and help, write some journalistic narrative about this and how bad the hospital
Yeah.
is doing and how terribly this country's falling apart. I don't know. I didn't read all that drama, but
Yeah.
he didn't take the right path, point blank period. So that carve out wouldn't apply, I think, in any case.
Yeah, agreed. And I think it's common for these types of laws to have a carve out for law enforcement. So, the law enforcement does need to know when things are happening, and including stuff like this. Yeah, I agree. But and like even I'm gonna throw out a broad bad hypothetical, but let's say I don't know, I'm gonna pick the wrong, let's say I'm trying to think of the wrong person, the wrong healthcare provider doing the wrong thing. So, um, a doctor who cares for your feet all of a sudden is doing breast implants. Okay.
Okay.
Um, and they're not authorized to do it. So somebody decides to whistleblow on them. It's not necessary to give the private health information of the patients that happened to like just to say, I think this is a really bad example, but I think my point is, they didn't have to share, he didn't have to share all of this private health information about these patients in order to achieve his goal. So, yes, I don't agree that this practice should have been against the law, but in Texas it was. Um, but I don't think it was necessary for private health information of patients to be revealed in order to disclose that a law was being broken. Like,
Right.
just simply to say, hey, this hospital is doing something it's not supposed to be doing, and let the investigators take it from there. And then, they would have access to the healthcare information if they needed it. So yeah, I might have just been saying exactly what you already said, Rachel.
No,
So
but with
sorry if I'm
a good, clear example. And I mean, I think in this exact circumstance, this scenario, these names weren't just an arbitrary list that were just posted somewhere randomly on the internet. This was
yeah,
a list of minors either undergoing, will undergo probably all statuses of gender affirming care. And that's particularly sensitive information. It's gender identity information. That is not an easy thing to just put back in the bottle. And one could argue that yes, perhaps they're going under some transition and eventually would, identify as another gender or some such sort. But
sure.
that doesn't mean that they wanted this disclosed to the world in this journalistic fashion. There surely is going to be media attention on this, and that spotlight is going to go onto patients that had no interest in being, intruded on in that way. And so I
Right.
feel really, really sympathetic for the individuals on this list who were caught in terrible circumstances, trying to do what they feel is best for their own health and their own sanctity.
Right. And clearly with parent, and I guess it's not clear, but I would assume with parental involvement, because children can't make these types of decisions in by themselves. Like, I think there's got to be some other adult that is, I don't know, guiding them through
Still,
these. But
perhaps more people to have been drawn attention to in a circumstance that they never desired to be published or talked about in major media discourse.
yeah, so do you know anything more about what, so this data was turned over to, this conservative think tank or whoever they were. What did they do with the data? Did they publish it? Do
I
they, I mean,
assume
the
it was
purpose was to turn it
published.
over to law
Let's see.
enforcement.
Let's see if I can find those details quickly. I didn't take
Yeah.
note of that. Let's see.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, you're good. Yeah, well,
Um,
he's been interviewed by Fox News.
yeah.
It's been published in a journalistic fashion. Unfortunately, I don't think I would be a recipient of some of these publications. Um,
Right. I don't, and I wondered, and I'm not putting you on the spot to answer this, but I wonder how common, like, it doesn't surprise me that the state of Texas has taken this position. I'm curious about other states who are doing the same thing because there's a lot of outrage about gender affirming care, and not just for children, just the overall thing.
yeah,
So I may research that, but that gets beyond the scope of privacy and really what we're addressing here.
yes.
Because even in situations or subject matter that is controversial, and regardless of what my position is on what's happening, the privacy of the data, because that's what we do. That's
Mhm.
what we're experts in. We need to protect the privacy of people.
Especially when we, have the necessary frameworks, standards, acts in
Yeah.
place to help prevent that. So I'm interested to see where this goes. That is as much information as I have now. Again, I think this is a really unfortunate story and circumstance for the individuals involved. And
Yeah.
I'm very
Agreed.
interested to see how this pans out in court.
Okay, we don't normally do this, but we might come back to this as a little update in a future episode.
I'd be
Speaking of
happy
which,
to.
we have ideas for other episodes, so maybe we won't have as long a gap before our next episode lands.
Yeah, new series if I'll tease it out, but excited to
Yeah,
work on that with you, John. And I guess till next time.
yeah, yeah. Thank you. This was a good one. Good. Yeah, this was a good find. So thanks, Rachel. So yeah, till next time.
Yes. Bye,
See
everyone.
you.